searching, Alan found the book. Alan reached inside and retrieved something, the Ring of Radiance. The next day, after the presentation, someone informed Alan, "Baruch has challenged you to a friendly duel." Alan paused, then said with slight frustration, "Again?" As Alan stood there, he could feel it. The stares, the curiosity, the judgment. Basically, the entire wizard community had collectively decided, yeah, let's watch this guy. And naturally, his brain started overthinking. He remembered how Leon was glaring at Baruch yesterday like she was about to start a war, and started piecing things together. Baruch, 4th rank, which, in the wizard world, is not just one level higher. No, ranks here are ridiculous. The higher you go, the bigger the gap becomes. So the difference between rank 3 and rank 4, that's not a step, that's a cliff. And yet Baruch reached that level at his age, which meant one thing: genius. Annoying, confident, probably unbearable genius. And right on cue, Baruch opened his mouth and immediately chose violence. He casually threw out a line implying that the great wizard, who supposedly helped defeat an outer god, might actually be fake, which was basically the wizard version of saying, "I think you're a fraud. Prove me wrong." Even the surrounding wizards were like, "Bro, chill." But Alan, he understood instantly. This wasn't random. This was a setup, a provocation. And honestly, that was enough. Because Alan had a very simple philosophy. If someone provokes you for no reason, give them a reason. He wasn't about to ignore it, especially not from someone who, in his mind, didn't look that hard to beat. So instead of backing down, he put on his magic-enhanced glove, looked at him, and said, "I accept." And just like that, we got ourselves a duel. Meanwhile, Baruch was feeling amazing. Everything was going exactly according to plan. From the beginning, provoking Alan wasn't about anger, it was marketing. He wanted attention. More specifically, he wanted useful attention. Being the son of the Violet Tower Master already gave him influence. But that wasn't enough. He wanted to stand out. And what better way than to challenge the guy surrounded by crazy rumors? A walking headline. Baruch smirked, thinking about all the stories going around about Alan, especially the one about him taming Penia, which honestly sounded fake even to him. But here's the thing. Baruch didn't gamble. He came prepared. He subtly activated the ring on his finger, an artifact designed to estimate a person's rank and magic power. Simple, reliable, and right now, it showed a very clear number, 3. Baruch smiled, because that confirmed everything. He's weak. Same result as yesterday. Same result as before. No change, meaning all those rumors, exaggerated, blown out of proportion, completely fake, and in Baruch's mind, that meant one thing. He just caught a big fish. The duel began. The referee gave the usual warning about not killing each other, which is always a good sign in a friendly match, and then signaled the start. Baruch stepped forward confidently, already planning how to handle this. Should he end it quickly? No, too boring. Should he drag it out? Maybe, but risky. Too long and people might question things. Too fast and it won't leave an impact. So he decided, end it quickly, but not too quickly. Perfect plan. Flawless logic. Absolutely nothing could go wrong. He started preparing his magic spell with confidence and he smirked. But then he breathed and saw white air. He paused, confused, because last time he checked, this wasn't winter, and yet cold air filled his lungs. Fast, too fast. Before he could even process what was happening, his legs froze, literally, ice, solid, and not just his legs, everything, the arena, the ground, the air. Frost started spreading like it had been waiting for this moment its entire life. Within seconds, the entire battlefield turned into a frozen wasteland, and at the center of it, Alan, standing there, calm, expressionless, like this was just another Tuesday. And at that moment, Baruch realized something very important. He messed up, badly, but unfortunately, realizations don't stop spells, because Alan had already started. He said, "Glory of the snowy mountains." Yeah, that doesn't sound friendly. Then he said, "Crystal." Small spheres began forming everywhere, floating. Dozens of them, looking harmless, which is exactly how dangerous things look right before disaster. And now they were spinning, slowly, casually, like they had all the time in the world. Everyone watching was confused. confused. What is this? What does it do? Why is it so calm? A few moments earlier, right in front of the duel arena, Milan was standing there, looking like a man who had just witnessed something illegal against the laws of reality. Because yesterday, he saw Pania. Yes, that Pania. The Blue Tower's certified menace. The walking problem. The human definition of someone please stop her. Acting like a polite, well-behaved, emotionally stable person in front of Count Palatio. So naturally, Milan did what any sane wizard would do. He said, "Master, you're not going to believe this." Kellum, a respected fifth-tier wizard, immediately regretted listening, because the next sentence he heard was, "Pania apologized." Silence. Kellum blinked once, twice, then immediately concluded, "My disciple has lost his mind," because that statement, impossible. Completely impossible. More impossible than a mage forgetting coffee. So he asked again, carefully, slowly, just to make sure, and Milan nodded, dead serious, saying it happened the moment she saw Count Palatio. No hesitation, no delay, instant submission. At this point, Kellum wasn't just confused, he was concerned, because this wasn't just strange, this was dangerous information. There were already rumors about this count flying around everywhere. Wild ones, ridiculous ones, the kind you don't fully believe but also don't want to test personally. And now, this got added to the list, so Kellum decided he needed to see it himself. Now, as a fifth-tier wizard, Kellum wasn't weak. His senses were sharp. He could roughly gauge someone's magical power just by feeling their presence. Not perfect like a sixth tier with the eye, but still reliable enough. And when he looked at Count Palatio, he frowned, because something didn't add up at all. The mana was weak, like suspiciously weak, not hidden power weak, not restrained genius weak, just low, very low. And that immediately raised a question in his mind, because sure, knowledge matters, skill matters, technique matters, but at the end of the day, if your mana pool is tiny, you're not casting anything impressive. That's just basic wizard logic. So now Kellum was thinking, what if everything is fake? What if all those rumors, the outer god, Pania, the reputation, all of it, exaggerated, or worse, self-made propaganda? Because let's be honest, that would be a genius move. Risky, but genius. And it wasn't just him. The other professor-level wizards around him thinking the same thing. One of them casually commented that he couldn't feel anything impressive from the count. Another agreed, saying the mana pool was way too small for someone of high rank. Someone else straight up called it nonsense, even said the guy probably built his reputation himself. And honestly, they all agreed, because from a logical standpoint, everything pointed to one conclusion: fraud. A very well-marketed fraud. And this duel, this friendly match, perfect timing, because now everything would be exposed. The truth would come out, the rumors would collapse, the reputation would shatter, and Count Palatio would finally be revealed as just another overhyped noble. Then the duel started, and everything changed, because the moment the arena turned into a frozen nightmare, everyone went silent. Not just the professors, not just Kellum, everyone, even the lower-tier wizards who were just there for entertainment. No comments, no analysis, no opinions, just silence. Because suddenly, they weren't watching a fraud anymore. They were watching something they couldn't understand. Meanwhile, Baruch finally snapped out of it and panicked, because suddenly, this wasn't about reputation anymore. This was about survival. He rushed to prepare his strongest spell, one of the Violet Tower's main offensive spells, which, by the way, is not something you use in a friendly match unless things have gone very wrong, and things had definitely gone wrong. But before he could finish, one of the spheres popped. That's it. No explosion, no drama, just pop, and Baruch instantly turned into an ice statue. No movement, no spell, no dignity, just frozen. Silence. Again. Then the referee, completely confused, slightly traumatized, and probably questioning his career choices, announced, "The winner is Alan Palladio." And just like that, the duel ended in record time, with maximum emotional damage. The wizards who were throwing suspicious looks at Alan just a moment ago, yeah, now they were completely frozen, mouths open, brains offline, because what they just witnessed did not make sense at all. They knew exactly what he did, and that was the problem. Composite magic. Not one spell, not two, more than three at the same time. Now, technically, that's not impossible. Any decent fifth-tier wizard could attempt only one, but here here's the catch. Doing it perfectly? No mistakes? No instability? No accidental self-destruction? Yeah, that's where everyone fails. So now the real question wasn't what he did. It was, how? The same people who were doubting him 5 minutes ago? Yeah, they deleted that thought immediately. Gone. Uninstalled. Now they were just impressed, confused, slightly scared, and extremely curious. They started bombarding him with questions like a group chat that suddenly got active at 3 a.m. What was that seal? Was that ancient magic? How did you structure that? Explain your logic. Explain your life choices. Explain everything. And Alan, just standing there, realizing something weird, none of them recognized what he used. Not the seals, not the phrases, nothing, which was suspicious, because he knew his magic came from a forgotten era. But this level of ignorance, that was new. That was interesting. That was slightly concerning. Then things got even weirder, because somehow the topic shifted to his rank. And when Alan casually mentioned he was third tier, the entire room collectively said, "Nice joke." They thought he was being modest, or trolling, or lying for fun, because there was absolutely no way the guy who just froze reality itself was rank 3. So naturally they rejected reality, because reality was uncomfortable. Alan, as always, run away and left them behind, and decided he had enough social interaction for one day. He started playing with the ring on his finger, the memory of the black eye, and honestly, he was satisfied, because this thing, broken, simple ability, store a spell, use it later, with a bonus, that's it. But for Alan, game changer. Because of his annoying limitation, only being able to cast a few spells, this ring basically doubled his options. Before, use one spell, suffer. Now, store, reuse, dominate. Efficiency level, max. Night fell, and instead of resting like a normal person, Alan went to the library. Of course he did, because when your life is weird, you go to haunted places voluntarily. The library was empty, silent, lit only by the blue moon. Very normal, very safe, absolutely not a horror setup. Then a voice, deep, echoing, right in his head. Someone solved the riddle, and apparently that someone was him. Now here's the thing. Alan knew exactly who this was, and that's why he was nervous. Very nervous, because this wasn't just anyone. This was her, the first human to reach 8th tier after the Forgotten Age, a legendary archmage, a walking nightmare, a being respected, feared, and avoided. The first chalice, the eternal terror, also known by players as the one who kills you for bad dialogue choices. Yes, that one. Heinkel and Alan, trying very hard not to mess this up, because one wrong sentence, and he's dead. No second chances. No, oops, just instant deletion. So he mentally reviewed everything. Don't say the wrong thing, don't trigger her, don't mention weird topics, especially not milk. Never milk. Then she appeared. Blue magic gathered, formed, and there she was. Calm smile, overwhelming presence, absolute legend. Alan braced himself, ready for a dangerous conversation, ready for a test, ready for anything. And then she looked at him and said, "What?" Not majestic, not powerful, not intimidating. That was pure fear. And Alan just stood there like, what? Because somehow the eternal terror was terrified of him. He blinked, looked at her, processed the situation, and then his brain noticed something very important, something completely irrelevant, something life-changing. She was short, like really short. The hat was doing all the work. The illusion was broken. The legend, compact edition. Still, he tried to continue normally, said he wanted to solve the riddle, play it safe, follow the script. But before he could even finish, she panicked, saying, "I'll give it to you." Alan inquired, "Excuse me?" No riddle, no test, no conditions. She just summoned the reward and handed it to him, like someone trying to get rid of a problem as fast as possible. She inquired, "Good enough, right?" She looked nervous, anxious, like she wanted to leave immediately, which she did. She said, I'm leaving," and just like that, she disappeared. Gone. No explanation, no dignity, just panic teleport. Alan stood there, holding the box, processing life, because that was not how this was supposed to go at all. He even canceled the emergency spell he prepared, because clearly he didn't need it. After a moment, he opened the box, and yeah, the item was there, exactly what he wanted. No effort required, which should have been great, but instead, it raised more questions. Because now the real mystery wasn't the item, it was, why was she scared? And more importantly, what was she looking at? Because she wasn't staring at him, she was looking behind him. So naturally, Alan turned around, slowly, carefully, expecting something, anything, a presence, a shadow, a horror beyond comprehension. Nothing, just the empty library, under the blue moon, silent, peaceful, normal, and somehow that was even more unsettling. For the next few days, Alan attended the magical conference. He listened to various presentations and satisfied his curiosity. The theories discussed at the conference were especially helpful to Alan, who had learned magic mostly through self-study until now. At night, Alan often discussed magic with Leon. Those conversations greatly helped improve his abilities. Unlike Alan, who possessed exceptional mana control, Leon excelled at constructing magical frameworks needed to manifest spells themselves. Because of that, Alan gradually gained confidence. Alan thought, I might soon be able to attempt 4th rank magic. Of course, 4th rank magic consumed an enormous amount of mana. Even using it once properly was difficult, so Alan had no intention of trying it immediately. Then, on the 4th day of the conference, Alan heard unexpected news. Evan said, a foreign entity has appeared in the labyrinth of Lartania. Alan looked at him and asked, a foreign entity? Evan nodded and replied, yes, I heard it caused mutations throughout the entire labyrinth. Alan immediately asked, how long has it been since it appeared? Evan answered, it's uncertain, but they believe it's been around 5 days. Evan added, the Information Guild suspects it may have appeared about a week ago. Alan asked again, how far is Lartania from here? Evan thought briefly and replied, it's not too far, around 5 days by carriage. After hearing that, Alan fell silent for a moment. Alan handed over the letter and said, send this to Lartania. Then he added immediately, I'm leaving right away, without wasting time. He left the Central Magic Tower and began preparing for the journey to Lartania. Before departing, Alan said farewell to Leon. Leon looked disappointed that he was leaving earlier than expected. He also met Penia. Penia reacted energetically after hearing he was leaving. She was almost so happy. After that, Alan headed directly toward Lartania. 5 days passed. Traveling non-stop by carriage, Alan finally arrived at the Labyrinth City. Evan looked around in admiration and said, wow, it's changed a lot since the last time I was here. It's even more fascinating now. After traveling through the city by carriage, Alan arrived at the Southern District. Soon, he stopped before a building. The shop called Merd, owned by Rhine. The moment Alan saw it, he froze slightly. Alan stared upward and said, is this really Merde? Evan looked equally confused and replied, yes, I think this is the right place. The reason for their reaction was simple. The building was enormous. Compared to the surrounding 4- and 5-story buildings, they looked like toy houses. Alan looked at the structure and asked, isn't this supposed to be a shop? Evan replied uncertainly, it should be. I heard the shop was big, but I didn't expect it to be this big. Alan nodded slightly. He knew the business was successful, but not to this extent. Alan thought, to think a magical appraiser could hold this much power. Then he thought again, is this why she gained so much influence in Lartania? Unconsciously, he nodded. Money held power in both worlds. Alan thought, that's one reason I came here to ask for a favor. Although dealing with the foreign entity was his main objective, he also needed Rhine's influence. Alan said, let's go inside. Together with Evan, he walked toward the massive entrance. As they approached, a receptionist standing by the door asked, do you have an appointment? Alan paused and asked, do we need one? The receptionist nodded politely and replied, if the matter is urgent, you may meet her immediately by paying the fee. Alan asked, a fee? The receptionist replied, yes. Meeting Lady Rhine without an appointment costs 3,000 gold coins. Evan's eyes widened. Alan repeated slowly, 3,000 gold coins? The amount was enough to purchase a mansion, even in the capital. After a brief silence, Alan asked, and if I make an appointment now? The receptionist checked something and replied, about 10. Alan frowned slightly and asked, 10? The receptionist answered, 10 months, approximately. The answer was absurd enough to make Alan dizzy. After thinking briefly, Alan said, at least deliver a message for me. Tell her Count Palladio is here. Before he could finish, a rude voice interrupted. A noble-looking man sneered and said, ugh, you're noisy. Just get lost already. The man radiated arrogance. Behind him stood several mercenaries. The noble looked at Alan with open disdain and said, why is a penniless beggar standing around here? Alan's expression turned blank with disbelief. Ignoring him, the noble approached the receptionist and tossed a pouch of money toward her. The man ordered, open the door? The receptionist checked the pouch, then respectfully nodded. Moments later, the massive doors began opening with a loud rumble. Before entering, the noble glanced back at Alan and smirked provocatively. The man sneered, "Pathetic beggar." Then he entered. The mercenaries behind him openly mocked Alan as they followed. Watching them, Alan frowned slightly. Then he remembered who the man was. Alan thought, the son of Lartania's lord. He vaguely remembered the character from Psychedelia, a bloated man with a sleazy mustache, a notorious scoundrel. Even in the game, he had been unpleasant, but seeing him in person felt worse. Just as Alan was about to speak, a voice came from inside. Rhine said, "No need to go inside." Rhine stepped out through the open doorway. Her green eyes glowed faintly. The scoundrel's face immediately brightened. The man smiled eagerly and said, "Oh, Rhine, you came all the way out here for me?" But Rhine looked at him coldly and said, "Get lost." Without hesitation, she shoved his shoulder aside, then walked right past him and the mercenaries. Ignoring the embarrassed receptionist, Rhine approached Alan directly. Unlike her attitude toward the noble, she treated Alan with complete respect. Rhine lowered her head politely and said, "I've been expecting you, Godfather." Everyone nearby froze in disbelief. All eyes turned toward Count Palatio. The receptionist's brain stopped functioning. The receptionist thought, what is happening? For nearly 2 years, she had watched Rhine interact with powerful figures, lords, high-ranking nobles, even the prince of the Ashtalon kingdom. Rhine had never bowed to anyone, not once. Yet now, she was bowing respectfully to an unknown count. Lavalde frowned violently and said, "What did you just say to me?" Rhine answered immediately. Rhine repeated calmly, "I believe I told you to get lost." The receptionist's eyes widened even further. At this point, it wasn't even subtle anymore. This was a direct declaration of hostility. Even Lavalde understood that. He let out an incredulous laugh before his expression twisted viciously. Lavalde sneered, "I don't know what's so special about that penniless noble." Then he growled, "But you'll regret turning your back on me." With that, he stormed out. His mercenaries hurried after him. After Lavalde finally disappeared, the atmosphere calmed slightly. Only then did Aelon properly speak with Rhine. Rhine said calmly, "I received your letter." Then she added politely, "It must have been a difficult trip, Godfather." She glanced at Evan and added, "And for you as well, Uncle." Unlike Deus, who barely spoke, or Seolrang, who spoke too much, Rhine's calm manner felt strangely balanced. Alan looked at her for a moment before asking. Alan asked, "But is this really okay?" Rhine tilted her head slightly and replied, "What exactly are you referring to?" Alan answered, "Lavalde." Now remembering the man's identity clearly, Alan became slightly concerned. He knew how much authority the Lord of Lartania possessed, and he also knew the Lord constantly protected his son. Alan worried Rhine might face problems because of this, but Rhine answered casually. Rhine said, "You don't need to worry about that." Alan replied carefully, "Really? He's still the Lord's son." Alan continued, "It seems like he could cause trouble for you." Rhine answered calmly, "He probably won't show up again." Then she added, "Though I didn't expect you to know who he was." Alan paused briefly before replying naturally. Alan said, "He's famous in Lartania for both his face and his personality." Rhine nodded slightly and replied, "I see." Then she repeated, "In any case, there's no need to worry." Although her voice remained emotionless, there was undeniable confidence behind it. Alan nodded lightly. Alan said, "Well, if you're sure." After that, they spoke casually for a while, mostly simple topics. How work in Lartania was going, whether she still contacted the orphanage children, small things, ordinary things. Yet somehow, Alan found himself feeling unusually satisfied. Rhine had grown up well. Not that Deus or Seolrang hadn't matured, but Rhine especially gave the feeling of a diligent daughter, and strangely, that made Alan proud. Eventually, Alan brought up the real reason for his visit. Alan said, "Actually, there's a favor I wanted to ask." Rhine immediately replied, "Please ask freely." Alan asked, "Is a subjugation force currently being formed against the outer god?" Rhine thought briefly before answering. Rhine replied, "Yes." Then she added, "I believe preparations are already underway." Alan immediately asked, "Would you be able to help me join it?" That was the true reason he came to see Rhine immediately after arriving in Lartania. Without influence, joining the force could be difficult, even with his reputation. And after what happened with Lavalde, it might become even harder. Alan hesitated slightly and said, although after earlier, it may have become difficult. But before he could continue, Ryan interrupted him calmly. Ryan said, "That should be possible." Alan blinked. Alan asked, "Really?" Ryan nodded. Ryan replied simply, "Yes." Alan hesitated before asking carefully. Alan said, "But things seemed pretty tense between you and the Lord's son earlier." Ryan responded without concern. Ryan asked, "Is he really that important to you?" Alan replied, "Lavalde?" Ryan nodded. "Yes." Alan answered honestly, "Well, he's the Lord's precious son. I thought he might trouble you." Ryan listened quietly before speaking again. Ryan said, "As I said before, you don't need to worry about that." Her tone remained blunt, yet reassuring, oddly reassuring. Alan eventually nodded. "All right, I'll leave it to you then." Again, he felt strangely proud. After talking a little longer, a thought suddenly crossed Alan's mind. Alan asked, "By the way, why do you call me Godfather?" Ryan blinked once. Ryan replied, "Excuse me?" Alan explained. Alan said, "Deus and Seolrang call me benefactor or master." "But why Godfather?" Ryan fell silent briefly, thinking carefully. Then she answered simply. Ryan replied, "Because it felt like the most fitting word." Alan nodded slightly. "I see." After a short silence, Ryan spoke again. "You should rest for now. You must be tired from the journey." Afterward, Ryan prepared rooms for Alan and Evan inside Mird, then disappeared somewhere. The moment she left, Evan finally spoke. Evan said, "Wow, she really matured." Alan looked at him and asked, "Did she?" Evan nodded immediately. "She's still blunt, but she was always like that." Evan smiled slightly and said, "Honestly, out of all the kids, I think she grew up the best." Alan nodded in agreement. "Indeed." Then he added thoughtfully, "She feels like she matured in the most textbook way possible." Since Ryan said she would inform them later about future plans, and since they had only recently returned from the north, Alan decided resting was the best option for now. With that thought, so he slept as if he hadn't slept before. So even after sleeping for quite a while, he still woke up feeling groggy. Seeing sunlight streaming through the window, Alan slowly got out of bed. He changed clothes and left the room. Soon, Evan guided him toward the dining area. There, he found Ryan calmly eating lunch. The moment Alan sat down, Ryan spoke casually. Ryan said, "I've taken care of the matter you mentioned yesterday." Alan blinked and asked, "Already?" Ryan nodded. "Yes." Then she added, "There's a regular meeting today so you can attend it." Alan was briefly impressed by how efficiently she handled things, but before he could think more about it, Ryan casually continued eating her sausage and said, "Oh, and I also handled Laval de Greystone." Then, as if discussing the weather, she calmly said, "I killed him cleanly so you don't need to worry anymore." Alan almost nodded automatically, saying, "I see, good work. I knew you would kill him." Then his brain caught up. Alan froze. Alan said slowly, What?" His mind immediately filled with question marks. To be fair, Laval Greystone truly was human garbage. Among all the characters in Psychedelia, he was one of the worst scumbags imaginable. The massacre at the Level 30 mercenary camp, the Monster Abyss absorption incident, the Chimera biological experiments, countless terrible side stories in Lartania existed because of him. Objectively speaking, the city was probably safer without him alive. But there was one major problem. Laval was the Lord's son. Inside Lartania, that position practically made him royalty, meaning Reen had casually committed something very close to regicide. Still stunned, Alan repeated blankly, "You killed him?" Ryan nodded casually, "Yes." Alan stared at her and asked again, "Laval Greystone?" Ryan took another bite of food and answered calmly, "Yes." She sounded like she was discussing breakfast. Meanwhile, Alan felt like his soul was leaving his body. Alan asked weakly, "Seriously?" Ryan tilted her head slightly and replied, "Yes, Godfather." "Was there a problem?" Alan stared at her for a moment before finally asking, "Why did you kill him?" Ryan answered immediately, "Because you said he was bothering you. But if he stayed alive, wouldn't he continue bothering you, Godfather?" At that moment, cold sweat ran down his back. He suddenly remembered something important. Alan thought, right. She's one of the 5 great sins. Because Ryan acted like such a well-raised daughter, he had momentarily forgotten. But in the future, she was destined to become one of the seeds of disaster. Then another thought hit him. Alan thought, wait, how did she even kill him? Laval himself wasn't strong, but the mercenaries surrounding him absolutely were. Most of them were at least A-rank level. Rhine wasn't even a combat specialist. She was an appraiser. So how exactly did she kill all of them? While Alan looked visibly confused, Rhine cautiously spoke. Was there a problem? Perhaps because Alan kept repeating the same questions. Rhine now looked slightly dejected, as if wondering whether she had made a mistake. Alan hurriedly shook his head. He replied, "Not exactly a problem. More like, is this really okay? Your safety, mostly." Rhine responded immediately. "You don't need to worry about that. I disguised myself properly." Although her expression remained neutral, she sounded strangely proud of herself. Watching her, Alan suddenly remembered an old phrase from an online community. Alan thought, so this is what people mean by having a completely different mindset? He cleared his throat awkwardly. He said, "Anyway, thanks for worrying about me, and don't feel too bad about it." Rhine immediately responded flatly. "I'm not feeling bad," Alan thought. "You definitely looked dejected a second ago, though." Then Rhine repeated firmly, "I'm really not." Alan looked at her with genuine amazement. Alan thought, how can someone casually commit regicide, yet get embarrassed over something like this? After a brief silence, Alan spoke again. "Anyway, try not to put yourself in danger if possible, because all kinds of problems could happen." Alan added, "You could get hurt, and everything you built here could collapse instantly." Rhine stared at him, confused, as if she genuinely didn't understand. Even though his explanation was perfectly reasonable, she still tilted her head slightly. Then, after thinking seriously for a moment, Rhine suddenly said, "Ah," as if she finally realized something. Then she nodded slightly and added, "Don't worry too much, Godfather. I understand my duties properly." After saying that, she calmly resumed eating. Alan stared blankly at her. Somehow, even though they were having a conversation, it felt like they were talking about entirely different subjects. Still, he decided not to continue. After all, no matter how absurdly excessive her actions were, she had done it for his sake. As Alan absent-mindedly ate his sausage, still wondering whether this situation was insane, Rhine suddenly spoke again. "Oh, I wanted to show you something, Godfather." The eye of the tracker. Alan looked up. After finishing the meal, Alan followed Rhine into another room. Inside, something floated quietly in the air, a golden eye, surrounded by blue light. The moment Alan saw it, he immediately realized this wasn't ordinary. Then Rhine's earlier words echoed in his mind. Alan thought, that's the eye of the tracker? He looked genuinely stunned. Originally, the eye of the tracker had just been a simple artifact, a round sphere with a tiny eye-shaped jewel embedded inside. Its only effect was helping appraise low-level artifacts in slightly greater detail. That was all. Nothing special. There had never been any hidden lore attached to it, just like the essence of the Golden Mane tribe, which meant Alan had absolutely no idea it possessed a hidden function like this. Rhine looked at the floating eye and explained calmly, "The engravings are gathering smoothly." At that moment, Alan immediately understood. The eye of the tracker could accumulate and enhance engravings, and suddenly, everything made sense. Alan thought, so this is why she treated me so favorably? Merida's fame largely came from Rhine's engraving abilities, meaning the eye of the tracker played a major role in her success. Naturally, she felt grateful toward Alan because of it, even though Alan himself had absolutely no clue the artifact could do this. Still, admitting ignorance now would feel awkward, so Alan calmly nodded like he had known all along. Alan said smoothly, "I see. You're using it well." Rhine nodded. "Yes." Then she added, "Although gathering engravings became slower after 400, they're still accumulating steadily. I think I'll finish gathering all of them within a few years." Alan nodded seriously, even though internally he was dying of curiosity about what exactly was being gathered. But he decided not to ask. He feared it might expose the fact that he knew absolutely nothing. After a brief silence, Rhine spoke again. "Please follow me to the meeting room." Alan had two reasons for wanting to participate in the extermination of the Outer God. The first reason was simple. The current mercenaries alone would never be enough to defeat it. Of course, the mercenaries gathered from the 5 major guilds were monsters in their own right, people comparable to master knights or even figures like Baba Yaga. But even so, Alan already knew that still wouldn't be enough to kill the Outer God. The second reason was even more important. To successfully exterminate the Outer God, Alan needed strong mercenaries willing to follow his commands. That was why he absolutely had to join the extermination squad. Unfortunately, the moment he entered the meeting room, he immediately realized there was a problem. Maverick, the guild master of the Terranomad Guild, clicked his tongue irritably. Maverick scoffed, "Tch, Hyman, the guild master of the Arcadia Guild, looked Alon up and down with blatant disdain. Hyman sneered, "You're bringing this weak-looking guy along?" Mayan, the beast woman guild master of the ancient trackers, laughed mockingly with her slit-like feline eyes. Mayan smirked. "Ha, he looks like the type who survives entirely on rumors." Then she added mockingly. Mayan continued, "What are you here for? To stand in the back and steal credit?" Meanwhile, Argonia, the guild master of the Kalamadra Guild, and the strongest among the gathered mercenary leaders, simply stared at Alan silently. She said nothing, but her gaze clearly wasn't welcoming either. Alan calmly looked around the room. Alan thought, "I expected hostility, but this is worse than I thought." Still, Alan had expected something similar. After all, to mercenaries, he probably looked like some random noble carried entirely by rumors. Then, Mayan suddenly stepped forward. Spinning a dagger between her fingers, she blocked Alan's path completely. Mayan narrowed her feline eyes and said mockingly, "Noble lord, I heard rumors you've been sticking your nose into places you don't belong. But seeing you in person, you don't even look worth talking to. Why don't you just turn around and leave?" The atmosphere inside the room instantly became heavy. Alan looked at Mayan silently for a moment. Then he came to a simple conclusion. Alan thought, "I need to prove my worth first." Without hesitation, Alan slowly raised his left hand. The gauntlet covering it emitted a faint, metallic sound. Then he calmly formed a seal. At that moment, without any warning, the previously ordinary meeting room was instantly swallowed by freezing cold. Frost exploded across the floor. The air temperature dropped so suddenly that everyone instinctively stiffened. Alan calmly spoke. Concentration. At that instant, the surrounding mana and atmosphere compressed violently around Mayan. Alan spoke again. "Freeze!" Then, the gathered mana instantly reacted. Frost bloomed violently around Mayan's body. It multiplied in an instant. Then, ice completely encased her. Mayan froze solid before she could even draw a proper breath. Her shocked expression remained trapped inside the ice. Silence. There wasn't any special reason Alan chose Mayan. Simply put, she was the weakest combatant present. At least according to the settings Alan remembered. Compared to the others, Mayan hadn't yet reached the level of a true superhuman. That was why she failed to react to the sudden attack and got frozen immediately. The mercenaries finally realized something was very wrong, and they got ready to attack. Maverick shouted, "You're looking for a fight with us, is that it?" After glancing briefly at them and said coldly, "You're the ones who started it, aren't you?" Alan calmly walked forward. He had already passed them, not too quickly, not too slowly. He walked with steady composure, as if freezing a guildmaster solid was a perfectly normal greeting. Eventually, he sat down directly across from Argonia, then calmly crossed his legs. Alan looked around the room and said calmly, "I think we're finally at a level where we can talk. What do you think?" A heavy silence descended upon the meeting room. Maverick stared at Alan tensely. Hyman's mocking expression had disappeared completely. Even Argonia's gaze sharpened slightly. For the first time, all three looked at Alan seriously. Meanwhile, Alan sat there expressionlessly, outwardly calm. Internally, absolutely not. Alan thought, "Did I mess this up?" Cold sweat slowly formed beneath his clothes. Alan thought nervously, "Should I've used another method?" Then he immediately rejected the thought. He thought, no, there wasn't any faster way to establish dominance. Then another realization hit him. He thought, honestly, freezing Mayan only worked because I caught her off guard. While maintaining eye contact with Argonia, Alan also kept checking Mayan from the corner of his vision, still frozen. Thankfully, Alan thought anxiously, she's still frozen. He had already burned through all his mana. Using his enchanted armor, he had cast ice magic 5 times consecutively, which meant the moment the spell broke, Mayan would absolutely lose her mind. Alan already knew her personality. Alan thought, the second she gets out, she's definitely going feral. So now, everything depended on Argonia. If Argonia acknowledged him, the others would follow. That was the entire reason Alan dared to pull this stunt in the first place, because he trusted Argonia's personality. From the game, he knew Argonia was rational. Unlike the others, she prioritized logic over pride. And more importantly, there had actually been a quest extremely similar to this situation. Every single time, Argonia reacted the same way. The silence continued. Alan wanted desperately to say something, anything, but he forced himself not to. At this point, words didn't matter anymore. The mercenaries had to judge him themselves, and if he wanted their approval, he had to maintain composure. Finally, Maverick broke the silence. Maverick growled, "So what? You're challenging us?" His hand moved toward his sword. His expression looked ready to explode. The moment Alan saw that, his heart nearly stopped. Alan thought, "I'm dead." But then, Argonia suddenly spoke sharply. "Stop!" Maverick turned immediately. He snapped, "What?" Argonia replied calmly, "I said stop." Maverick glared angrily. He argued, "You want me to let this go after what he just did?" Argonia replied flatly, "We ignored him first." Maverick frowned deeply. Maverick protested, "Even so." Argonia's eyes narrowed slightly. Argonia interrupted coldly, "I told you to stop, didn't I?" The atmosphere instantly became heavier. Maverick clenched his jaw, clearly furious. But after several tense seconds, he finally clicked his tongue. Then he put his sword down. Seeing the situation settle, Alan internally released the biggest sigh of relief in his life. Still maintaining his poker face, Alan asked calmly, "When do you plan to descend into the labyrinth?" Argonia answered politely, "In 2 days." For a split second, Alan almost broke character. Alan thought, wait, was Argonia always this polite? Still, he kept going. Alan glanced subtly toward frozen Mayan. Then he suggested, "Then let's continue this meeting tomorrow. With one person frozen solid, it'll be difficult to hold a proper discussion anyway." In his mind, he thought, "I'm completely out of mana, and if that ice breaks, I'm doomed." Thankfully, Argonia nodded immediately. "Let's do that." The moment she accepted, Alan stood up instantly, turned around, and walked out of the room with perfect composure, saying, "See you tomorrow." Then, the second Alan exited the mansion, his composure shattered instantly. Alan clutched his chest and whispered internally, "This is terrible for my heart. I'm never doing something like this again." He exhaled shakily, then immediately hurried away before Mayan thawed out. Not long after Alan left, Maverick finally exploded. He growled irritably, "I seriously don't like that bastard. Why do you want to let that pretentious snob walk away?" But Argonia didn't respond. She only glanced at him. Hyman interrupted with a scoff. "Seriously? How are you still talking after Argonia saved your life?" Maverick blinked and frowned. "What?" Then Argonia quietly added, "Hyman's right. If you had attacked him with your sword earlier, you probably would have died." Maverick's face stiffened. Maverick snapped, "What kind of nonsense is—" Then he stopped, because only now he properly looked around. Sweat. Argonia was sweating. Maverick's eyes widened slightly. He had never seen Argonia like this before. Not once. Even Hyman, whom Maverick reluctantly admitted was stronger than himself, also looked tense. Maverick finally shut up. Argonia fell silent. In truth, she had an idea, but the knowledge wasn't hers. It came from her mother, the Red Dragon, the being who once told her there was only one thing in this world she should truly fear. A distant memory surfaced in Argonia's mind. Her mother's warning echoed clearly. "Remember this. If a black eye ever appears in the night sky, immediately look away. Do not acknowledge it. Do not remember it. And if you ever become a powerful mage someday, erase the memory entirely." Then, the final warning. "Never look directly at the one who consumes boundaries." Argonia remembered the earlier moment. That blue eye and the red eye. Not only one, but two. The two that appeared behind Count Palatio. Just remembering it made her feel cold. That endless ominousness. That feeling, as if her soul itself was being swallowed whole. And worst of all, that eye had looked at her almost playfully, as if smiling. Argonia slowly thought silently, who exactly is that man? The next day, contrary to Alan's worries that they might continue rejecting his plans and arguing with him, the meeting proceeded surprisingly smoothly, and Alan quickly realized two things. The first was that the foreign entity was currently on the 12th floor. The second was that the mercenaries intended to block it on the 5th floor. As soon as he heard that, Alan immediately began explaining the plan he had prepared beforehand in detail, while also sharing the information he had gathered regarding the foreign entity. The explanation lasted for about 30 minutes. Alan, who had even disguised his knowledge about the foreign entity as information obtained from an ancient book, quietly observed the gathered mercenaries with slight tension, wondering whether they would object. In the end, we'll probably have to compromise, right? The strategy Alan proposed was one he was personally confident in, a plan designed to subdue the foreign entity while minimizing casualties. But that was only from his own perspective. He understood perfectly well that the mercenaries were not his subordinates. He could not order them around. At best, he could only suggest a strategy. That was why he felt so nervous when he heard what they said. Let's go with that. I agree. No objections. Me neither. Without a single complaint, the plan was accepted immediately, leaving Alan standing there in bewilderment. Alan blinked blankly. Really? No one had any issues with it? Was yesterday's impact really that strong? He shook his head slightly. Even if yesterday's events had been shocking, there was no way that alone could make Argonia and the mercenaries of the 5 great guilds act this obediently, which naturally led Alan to another thought. Could it be? His gaze shifted toward Rhine, who had accompanied them to today's meeting. But Rhine herself seemed slightly confused. Even with her usual indifferent expression, there was a faint trace of bewilderment on her face as she quietly muttered, "I'm surprised the meeting went so smoothly." That only made Alan even more confused. Something feels off. Even Mian, who should have still held some resentment after being frozen by Alan yesterday, remained strangely quiet. And because of that, Alan unconsciously thought, looks like using my game knowledge really paid off. Once the preparations were complete, the group began descending into the labyrinth, carving a bloody path through endless waves of monsters. Watching the mercenaries fight firsthand, Alan's body trembled slightly with fear. He thought, I'm really glad I didn't come here alone. The scale of the battle was far beyond anything he had experienced personally. After some time, the mercenaries established a temporary resting area within one of the safe zones inside the labyrinth. While Alan was resting quietly, he suddenly heard a voice. Hey, it was Mayan. She had approached him without him even noticing. Alan instinctively became slightly tense, wondering if she had come looking for a fight. But instead, Mayan tilted her head and asked, "By the way, Count, do you have any prejudice against beast folk?" Alan answered honestly. "No, not really. And what happened before had nothing to do with discrimination." She said, "That's a relief." Alan looked at her in confusion and asked, "Why is that a relief?" Mayan smiled slyly. Her feline eyes narrowed mischievously. "Hey, Count, by any chance, would you be interested in sleeping with me?" She dropped the outrageous statement so casually that Alan's mind completely froze. For a brief moment, his brain stopped functioning altogether. Alan stared blankly at her before finally managing to ask. Suddenly, her cat-like ears twitched slightly. She said, "This is already our 3rd meeting. By now, we've already figured each other out, haven't we? I know you're strong." At those words, Alan finally understood where this was coming from. He remembered that Mayan's tribe revered strength above all else. After letting out a small sigh, Alan shook his head. "Sorry, but I'll have to decline." A hint of disappointment appeared on Mayan's face, but only briefly. Soon she sighed as though it was ridiculous that she had even reacted that way. "Well, nothing I can do about it then. I was honestly pretty thrilled when you overpowered me in one move." Then she winked playfully. "Still, let me know if you change your mind. I'm pretty charming, you know." As Alan stared blankly at Mayan's retreating figure, another voice suddenly echoed from behind him. "Shall I take care of it, sir?" It was Rhine. "She spoke rudely to you, sir." Rhine stared coldly at Mayan's back as she said those chilling words. Alan immediately pressed his lips together tightly, saying, "Huh? No need for that. No, you're not actually thinking about killing her just because of a few words, right? Bro, I swear," she truly thought. About a day passed after that, as the group continued advancing deeper into the labyrinth. By then, they had already reached the 4th floor. However, frustration gradually spread among the mercenaries because they still hadn't located the foreign entity. One of the mercenaries muttered that searching every single floor one by one was becoming a nightmare. Alan quietly clicked his tongue. As expected, reality is completely different from the game. Because they were moving as a large group, their speed was incredibly slow, and unlike in the game, there were no shortcuts. In the game, defeating certain monsters would naturally open the path to the next level, but reality was different. Monsters continuously appeared from every direction, and simply dealing with them consumed enormous amounts of time and energy. Looking around the labyrinth, Alan muttered in disbelief. How was this place even designed? After some time, he heard a voice. We're almost at the 5th floor. Hearing the mercenary's voice from ahead, Alan raised his gaze and saw a massive glowing door in the distance that resembled the exit of the labyrinth itself. Not long afterward, the group finally arrived at the 5th floor. Ryan explained calmly. The 5th floor is a safe zone, so it's relatively peaceful. Alan nodded. That's true. Then Argonia's voice echoed throughout the area. All right, take a short break and begin preparations immediately. Watching the mercenaries move with perfect coordination, Maverick clicked his tongue before shifting his gaze toward Alan. Honestly, he still didn't like him. No matter how many times he looked at Alan, he simply couldn't see what was supposedly so impressive about him. He thought, what's so special about a guy who's already panting just from walking through the labyrinth? Maverick looked at Alan several times, but still failed to notice anything remarkable. Eventually, he turned away with a confused expression. At that moment, Maverick suddenly felt something strange, something subtle, yet strangely familiar. As he frowned and tried to understand the source of that unsettling feeling, he finally realized it. The noise, the bustling sounds from the mercenaries preparing Alan's strategy had completely disappeared. It was as if time itself had stopped. Sensing something horribly wrong, Maverick immediately turned his head toward the mercenaries, and then he saw it. The mercenaries had frozen completely in place, like dolls. Every single one of them remained motionless, in the exact positions they had been in moments earlier, frozen. As Maverick tried to speak, the mercenaries' bodies suddenly began collapsing, slowly, like falling statues. Starting from their legs, their bodies tilted diagonally before crashing onto the ground. Blood spread across the ruins and the grassy plains. And then Maverick finally saw it. Standing calmly before the corpses of the fallen mercenaries was a goblin. The moment their eyes met, Maverick felt overwhelming despair consume him. And in that instant, he understood several things at once. The goblin before him had slaughtered his men. The goblin before him was the foreign entity they had come to exterminate, and he needed to draw his sword immediately. Yet despite knowing all of that, he could not move. He could not scream. He could not draw his weapon. He could not even call for help. He could do absolutely nothing, even though the creature standing before him was merely a goblin, one of the countless monsters he had slaughtered throughout his life. His instincts screamed at him. This was not a goblin. The creature's gaze locked onto Maverick. Then the goblin spoke. Who gave you permission to meet my eyes? It pronounced judgment. A finger slowly rose, steadily, calmly, and pointed directly at Maverick, as though marking his inevitable death. And then, just as Maverick, overwhelmed by terror, shut his eyes after seeing the finger begin to move, a cold, emotionless voice echoed across the battlefield. Freeze! The ground instantly froze over. Ice spread across the plains like a living creature, devouring the grass and stone alike as frost rapidly expanded in every direction. Get a hold of yourself! Hearing that voice, Maverick abruptly opened his eyes. And there, standing before him, was Alan. The goblin's body had been trapped inside a massive crescent-shaped crystal of ice, cold mist drifting from its surface. Kalus's eyebrows twitched slightly as he stared at Alan. Its raised finger slowly lowered as it rubbed its chin with interest, saying, "You're doing something amusing, insect." Watching him carefully, Alan quietly muttered, "Kalus." Because it was born lowly, it endlessly sought knowledge. Because it was born lowly, it eventually reached the boundary of truth and awakened to the laws themselves, ascending into a godlike existence. The king of gluttony, the devourer of boundaries. The moment Alan spoke his name, the curiosity in Kalus's eyes deepened. Kalus brushed his hair back with a grin. "You even know my name? Impressive. What a charming little human you are." Alan silently stared at Kalus, his expression tense. Why did the timeline change? According to the original report, Kalus was supposed to arrive on the 5th floor 3 days later. Not now. Not this early. Then Kalus slowly raised his hand again. His voice echoed softly. "Very well. I'm in a rather pleasant mood right now, and it seems the others are as well. So I shall show mercy." Kalus pointed lazily toward the upper floors. "Leave, and I'll spare your lives." But Alan answered immediately. "Prepare for battle." The extermination squad instantly reacted. Argonia forcibly suppressed the fear in her body and raised her voice. "All units, battle formation!" The atmosphere changed instantly. Weapons were drawn. Mana surged. The mercenaries moved according to the strategy Alan had prepared beforehand. Watching them, Alan thought, this time, they're prepared. Hearing Alan's response, Kalis looked at him as though staring at an idiot. Tsk, I was willing to spare you because you seemed entertaining, but if you insist on drinking the cup of punishment, Kalis slowly extended his hand forward once more. Then I shall grant your wish, insect. At that exact moment, an enormous wave of magic exploded outward from Kalis's hand, instantly rushing toward Alan and the mercenaries like a catastrophic storm. But, with the sharp sound of something shattering apart, Kalis's invisible slash was intercepted by the sword in Argonia's hand. The distorted magic split apart instantly. What Argonia wielded was one of the fewer than 100 weapons on the continent capable of severing magic itself, the Dispel Sword, a weapon incapable of cutting flesh, forged solely for the purpose of destroying magic. And against Kalis, who had not yet fully ascended to the level of a complete sage god, it proved effective. Kalis let out a low laugh. A sword of dissipation? How amusing. You insects prepared something rather entertaining. The moment those words ended, Argonia and Maverick simultaneously activated their sword techniques and charged forward. The ground exploded beneath their feet. Seeing the scene unfold, Alan instantly realized his assumption had been correct. It works. The Dispel Sword could interfere with the authority of an incompletely manifested outer god. Relief washed over him for a brief moment. At the same time, Maverick, Argonia, Hyman, and Meow launched a coordinated assault against Kalis. Sword strikes, mana blasts, arrows, aura, attacks rained down from every direction without pause, yet none of them could touch him. Kalis moved effortlessly through the battlefield as though dancing. Every attack narrowly missed him. Instead, the mercenaries' strikes crashed into the goblins scattered nearby, instantly blowing them apart. The battlefield descended further into chaos. Watching this, Alan immediately realized something. We're running out of time. If they wanted even the slightest chance of victory, they needed to seize the initiative now. Without hesitation, Alan activated his mana. Snowflake Formation. Glory of the Snowy Mountains. Blind Man's Fatality. One spell activated after another. A gigantic snowflake-shaped magic circle materialized before him, radiating overwhelming freezing mana. At the same time, Rinna opened her grimoire. Countless black chains erupted outward from the pages and shot toward Kalis in an attempt to bind him. And immediately after, Alan hurled the enormous snowflake toward Kalis. The sheer pressure of the combined attack distorted the surrounding air. Even Meow, Hyman, Maverick, and Argonia were visibly stunned by the overwhelming force rushing toward Kalis. Alan narrowed his eyes. If that lands, it'll definitely wound him. But then, Kalis casually lifted a single finger. Tap. That tiny motion alone instantly shattered both attacks apart. The chains exploded. The gigantic snowflake collapsed into fragments. Kalis smirked mockingly. You missed. Still, this is rather entertaining. Alan left in disbelief. According to his calculations, Kalis, who hadn't yet become a sage god, should have been destroyed by that direct hit. Alan, staring at him in confusion, realized that the exile's body had no trace of ice, only shattered remnants around him. He thought, did he slice through the ice spear halberd with just a slash? Then, Kalis finally released his own mana. Expansion, the way of the anonymous. In that moment, a surge of magical energy spread out. Sensing the danger instinctively, Argonia and Maverick, without hesitation, leapt toward Kalis, pushing off the ground. Mayon, who had just been relaxing moments earlier, quickly knocked an arrow and fired it, while Hyman raised his staff and cast a spell to intercept the Kalis's magic. However, just before Argonia and Maverick's swords reached the Kalis's neck, Mayon's arrow pierced his heart, and Hyman's magic approached his throat. The magic that had already spread around Kalis began to vibrate the air according to his incantation. Expansion. With that softly spoken word from Kalis, Argonia's and Maverick's bodies were severed apart instantly. Blood scattered across the battlefield. The fog slowly cleared. What remained was devastation. The surrounding terrain had been completely destroyed. Ruins stretched endlessly in every direction. Hyman froze in disbelief as he stared at the destruction before him. And before anyone could react, Kalis lazily moved a finger again. Slice! Though Hyman, knowing all too well what that action would result in, instinctively threw his body backward to dodge the invisible slash, he immediately tried to use Blink. But then, Kalis said, How will you dodge what's coming from above? With words that seemed mocking and a hand cutting from above to below, Hyman's body split apart instantly. Hyman's corpse collapsed onto the shattered ground. "Hyman!" Meow screamed and rushed toward him in desperation, but Kalis casually struck him aside. Meow's body was blown away violently across the battlefield. Kalis smiled cruelly. "I had such high expectations for you insects, so show me. How much longer can you continue entertaining me?" Watching the massacre unfold before his eyes, Alan finally understood something. "I've never seen magic like this before." Kalis was simultaneously using ritual gestures and incantations together. Beyond that, the gap between them was absolute. Skill, information, preparation, raw power, everything differed completely. Their entire strategy had collapsed. This was the worst possible scenario, and yet Alan still refused to give up. Then there was only one thing left for him to do: push his magic beyond its absolute limit. Alan immediately activated another spell. Glory of the Snowy Mountains, crystallization, then rotation. As Alan crossed his fingers together, a gigantic ring-shaped mana formation materialized before him. The spell stabilized successfully. Seeing that, Alan immediately realized it. It's working. From this point onward, only speed mattered, and continuing the battle itself. "Rinna!" At Alan's call, Rin instantly combined her magic with his. The chains intertwined with the freezing mana as the massive combined attack surged toward Kalis once more. Yet even while attacking, Alan understood a horrifying truth. To Kalis, this entire battle was nothing more than amusement. The outer god looked at them the same way a cat looked at a struggling mouse trapped beneath its claws. And just like before, Kalis effortlessly destroyed everything. The chains shattered. The freezing spell collapsed. The backlash exploded directly into Alan's body. Blood spilled from his mouth. Even then, he continued casting, again and again and again. But it was meaningless. Every spell was effortlessly nullified. Alan's breathing grew ragged. Even so, he refused to stop. By now, he had already consumed 5 mana potions. Mana toxicity had begun spreading throughout his body. His limbs grew heavier with every movement. Then, in the middle of the battlefield, Kalis suddenly appeared directly in front of Alan. At that exact moment, Alan realized it. This is Rinna's chance. Without hesitation, Alan and Rin combined their powers once more and launched another attack. As the spell formed, Alan focused on the final remaining constraint within his magic. Magic had been used against Earthaltis, the great god of duels. Magic had been used upon snowy terrain. Magic had been used at death's door. Magic had been used against a god itself. Alan realized that adding one more condition might allow him to distort the laws of the world even further. But even then, he knew it still wouldn't be enough. Desperately, Alan forced himself to think. There had to be an answer, something capable of ending everything in a single strike. Then, Kalis's earlier words resurfaced in his mind. "You still understand nothing." At the same time, Alan remembered the words of the shadowy figure. There were incantations, and there were principles connecting everything together. The moment those thoughts linked, Alan realized it. There's a clue. Sweat poured down his face. He grabbed his hair tightly. Then, as his thoughts finally reached a breakthrough, Alan activated an entirely new spell. Confusion and awakening are intrinsically one and the same. If you open your eyes, you will receive a key. The moment the incantation completed, Alan's mana erupted violently outward. A gigantic spear-shaped construct formed before him. Even Kalis's expression shifted slightly upon seeing it. "What are you trying to do?" Kalis's expression twisted. In response, he redirected Rhina's attack directly back toward them. But before it could strike, Alan stepped in front of it himself. Slash! The impact severed Alan's hand instantly. Blood scattered across the frozen battlefield. Yet at that moment, Alan finally understood. The instant he formed the mudra of the wisdom fist, the spell had transformed into a key. And when that key turned within the crystal, an entirely new form of magic had been born. The result, ice, crystal halberd, an overwhelming eruption of freezing power exploded outward. Massive crystals engulfed Kalis completely, trapping him inside an enormous prison of ice. And in the next instant, the entire plane transformed into a gigantic glacier. The moment Alan implemented frost crystal painted halberd, He understood the true nature of the spell. Its radius was barely 10 meters. By no means could it be called vast, and yet, within that confined space, the very laws of the world were rewritten. A principle as absolute and natural as water flowing from high places to low simply ceased to exist there, because the law of frost crystal painted halberd was singular. Everything within that space froze. No matter what it was, all things were forced beneath that inevitable law according to the will of the one who invoked the spell. However, the magic Alan had brought forth did not even last 6 full seconds before collapsing. From the very beginning, it had been a form of magic beyond what he was permitted to wield, whether in terms of mana or understanding. But even 6 seconds had been enough. A thin stream of blood trickled from Alan's mouth as he looked ahead. There stood the outer god, Kalis. His entire body had turned bluish-white, frozen solid as cracks spread across him before pieces of his body slowly crumbled away. Kalis laughed faintly. Ha! What a weak and shabby vessel. His condition was horrific. Both of his arms had already shattered, and even his legs were gradually breaking apart. Kalis continued. Well, that one certainly got me, and yet he was smiling, as if the stern expression from moments earlier had never existed. Kalis grinned broadly while staring at Alan. Kalis said, "If I had fully descended, if I had possessed a proper body capable of handling my authority completely, I could have blocked that pathetic implementation of yours with ease." His tone sounded almost regretful. "And then?" Alan replied calmly. Hypotheticals mean nothing. At Alan's calm reply, Kalis paused. The words he had been about to say stopped midway. Kalis chuckled softly. "A correct answer, little creature. No, mage." For the first time since the battle began, genuine acknowledgement appeared within Kalis's eyes. Kalis declared, "This is my defeat." The moment those words ended, his body completely crumbled apart and vanished. And then, Alan collapsed unconscious where he stood. The next day, within his dream, Alan felt someone gently touching his face, and a girl's voice softly echoed beside him. The girl whispered, "The world is at peace now, and I will always remain by your side." Then his eyes opened. An unbearable pain exploded through his skull as though his head were splitting apart. Trying to steady his trembling breath, Alan slowly lowered his gaze toward his left arm. His entire arm had turned bluish, as though severe frostbite had consumed it. Judging by appearance alone, it looked like something that should have already been amputated. But it was not limited to just his arm. Although the left side was the worst, bluish discoloration had spread throughout parts of his body like bruises stained deep beneath the skin. Fortunately, it was not frostbite. It was mana intoxication. Alan muttered weakly, "I can't put any strength into it at all." Seeing his arm remain completely motionless, as though all sensation had vanished from it, Alan let out a quiet sigh and leaned back against the crude bed. Truthfully, he had expected this possibility from the moment he started consuming mana potions recklessly during the battle. At least it only ended like this. Among the countless side effects caused by excessive mana potion consumption, mana nerve paralysis was one of the lighter outcomes. It would eventually heal with time. If it had been mana sinkhole syndrome, where the mana circuits permanently collapsed, or cardiac mana sclerosis, where mana hardened the heart itself, he would have died instantly. Just as Alan relaxed slightly, Rhine asked, "Are you all right, Godfather?" The curtain of the makeshift tent was pulled aside as Rhine stepped inside with her usual indifferent expression. Alan answered, "I'm only suffering from the intoxication symptoms. I'll recover eventually." After saying that, Alan looked toward her. Alan asked, "How are things outside?" Fortunately, the news was not entirely bad. Mayan and Argonia had survived. Mayan had coughed up blood during the battle, but after taking a potion, her injuries were only severe enough to limit her movements somewhat. Argonia's situation, however, was far worse. She had directly endured the outer god's magic. Although her half-dragon body and regenerative abilities had somehow kept her alive, she was practically half dead. After hearing the report, silence lingered inside the tent. Alan glanced quietly at Rhine. Her expression remained as blunt as ever, but something about her demeanor felt awkward today. Up until now, despite her cold personality, conversations with her had flowed naturally. But today, she seemed unwilling to continue the conversation herself. Just as Alan wondered whether he should speak first, Rhine suddenly opened her mouth. Rhine called softly, "Godfather, if it isn't rude, may I ask you one thing?" Alan nodded slightly. "All right, ask freely." At those words, Rhine hesitated briefly before speaking. She asked quietly, "Why did you save me?" Her voice remained calm, but there was something buried beneath it. Rhine continued, "My life, was it truly that important that you would risk your own defeat for it? By saving me, you placed yourself in danger." At her words, Alan quietly looked at her. Her expression remained unchanged, but her eyes contained a question so obvious that anyone could see it, as though what Alan had done simply made no sense to her. Hearing that, Alan suddenly remembered Seolrang asking him something similar once before, and for some reason, he began to feel slightly wronged. Seriously, what exactly do I look like to them? Do I have the face of some villain who raises children only to exploit them later? Of course, Alan had originally saved them in order to prevent the 5 great sins from taking root, but even so, he had never once believed they owed him anything in return. At most, he had only vaguely hoped that maybe, someday, they might give him a slightly nicer birthday present. That was all. So forcing his aching body upright, Alan sat on the flimsy cot and spoke with the same frustration he had once felt toward Seolrang. Alan said, "Rhine, I don't know what kind of person you think I am, but I never took you in so I could use you." Rhine blinked slightly. "Is that so?" Seeing her genuinely hesitate over the answer, Alan realized she truly had believed that, and so he continued. Alan spoke calmly, "I think of all of you as family." Rhine repeated softly, "Family?" Alan nodded. "Yes, family helps one another when times are difficult. Our relationship isn't based on profit or necessity, so there's no grand reason behind why I saved you." He let out a small breath. He smiled faintly. "I simply saved you because that was the natural thing to do, just as you would have saved me." At Alan's words, Rhine's eyes widened slightly. Because of her naturally expressionless personality, the reaction was subtle, but even that tiny change was enough for Alan to realize his sincerity had reached her. Alan continued gently, "Remember this, Rhine. We are not bound by a one-sided relationship, and if you truly want to do something for me," a faint smile appeared on Alan's face. Alan added jokingly, "Then at least remember my birthday." After finishing those slightly selfish words, he looked toward her. Rhine stared silently at Alan for a long while. She thought, so we were never merely pawns created to defeat the abyssal entities. Then, for the very first time, a faint smile appeared at the corner of her lips. Rhine answered quietly, "Understood, Godfather." Alan nodded slightly. "That's enough for me." Only then did Alan finally feel that at least part of his sincerity had reached her, and he quietly nodded. 5 days passed after that. Within the 5th floor, where neither day nor night existed, and only an endless blue sky stretched overhead, Alan had finally recovered enough to move again, and together with Argonia, whose monstrous regenerative ability had allowed her to stand once more, Alan asked, "Can you move?" Argonia answered, "To some extent." Hearing her answer, Alan looked at her with slight admiration. He muttered, "Impressive." 3 more days passed before the group finally managed to escape the labyrinth entirely. However, the moment they returned, Evan immediately exploded in anger after seeing the terrible condition Alan and Rhine were still in. He could not believe they had deliberately stopped him from following them, only for both of them to end up heavily injured anyway. In Evan's eyes, Alan had insisted that the guild leaders were enough support, yet the result clearly proved otherwise. Meanwhile, Alan and Rhine quietly sat there like children being scolded by their mother, while Evan continued lecturing them. Deep down, Alan admitted that the real reason he never wanted Evan involved was because he feared Evan's presence would completely derail his plans. In the original game, Evan had absolutely nothing to do with Labyrinth City. As time passed, news of the Strike Force's victory spread across the entire continent. At the same time, Alan and his group prepared to leave Merd behind. Before departing, Alan said goodbye to Rhine. During their farewell, Rhine asked for Alan's birthday date, and Alan revealed that it was on the 20th of September. Rena quietly engraved Alan's words deep into her heart. His birthday. She absolutely had to remember it perfectly. After all, this was the first request her godfather had ever personally made to her, which meant, naturally, that Rena had already escalated the situation far beyond normal human standards. words. Soon afterward, Alan's carriage departed from the 5th floor. As the carriage started moving, Evan smiled mischievously. Evan teased, "Young master, I suppose you're already looking forward to your next birthday." Alan immediately snorted. Alan replied casually, "Please, I already received enough gifts surviving that catastrophe." Evan chuckled knowingly. Evan said, "Still, gifts from your own children are special." Alan thought about it seriously for a moment. Then he lowered his expectations to the absolute minimum. Alan shrugged. "At most, I'll probably receive some wine." He paused. Alan added thoughtfully, "Maybe a small artifact." Meanwhile, somewhere far away, Raina was currently preparing to commit economic terrorism. Rin sat silently while thinking deeply about Alan's words. Family. The word itself felt unfamiliar to her. Because the Great Moon was naturally such a different existence compared to ordinary people, absolute faith and devotion toward him had always felt natural to her. To Rhine, victory alongside him had once seemed completely inevitable. However, after receiving Alan's recognition, the word family, which once held no meaning to her at all, finally became something real and attainable. Likewise, the title Godfather, which she had originally chosen out of pure respect, slowly transformed into the symbol of a genuine emotional bond. At that moment, Rhine sincerely wished to remain by Alan's side more than anyone else. She even resolved herself to answer immediately whenever her godfather needed her. The thought alone caused Rhine to become incredibly embarrassed, making her smile and blush uncontrollably. As she continued thinking about Alan's upcoming birthday, she began wondering what kind of gift she could possibly offer someone who considered her family. After thinking carefully, she eventually concluded that, for starters, the Lord of Latanya's castle itself should be enough. Meanwhile, Rinne continued thinking completely seriously. Rinne thought perhaps conquering nearby territories as additional birthday decorations would also be acceptable. As time passed, winter finally arrived at the Palatinate estate. Fortunately, Alan gradually recovered from his mana toxicity, mostly because his body had finally stopped trying to file a resignation letter. One peaceful afternoon, Evan entered while carrying a crystal ball. Evan announced, "Young master, a communication device has arrived from Duchess Altea." The moment Alan heard Altea's name, his survival instincts activated immediately. Alan narrowed his eyes suspiciously. Alan asked carefully, "How dangerous is this conversation going to be?" Soon afterward, the crystal activated and Altea appeared. Even now, Alan still could not adapt to seeing an actual duchess bow respectfully toward him. Every single time it happened, he felt like the world had bugged out. Altea spoke calmly. Altea reported, "Kalfa is progressing smoothly." Alan nodded seriously, despite understanding absolutely nothing about what Kalfa was currently doing. Then Altea dropped a nuclear bomb casually. Altea announced, "As of yesterday, we have successfully taken control of Asteria's entire underworld." Silence. Alan blinked, then blinked again, then spiritually disconnected from reality for 3 seconds. Alan thought, "Excuse me?" Altea smiled faintly. Altea congratulated him. "Congratulations on your achievement, Lord Alan." Alan almost collapsed on the spot. Achievement? What achievement? Then suddenly, he remembered something horrifying. At some point in the past, he had casually said, "We should probably stabilize the underworld first." That was it. That was the entire conversation. He had meant, "Please reduce crime a little." Altea apparently heard, "Conquer the criminal world and establish a shadow government." Alan immediately developed emotional damage. Meanwhile, Altea continued speaking respectfully. Altea explained, "Fortunately, the operation became much easier after you eliminated the leaders of both the royalist and aristocrat factions." Alan froze completely. Alan internally screamed, "That was an accident too!" But unfortunately, from Altea's perspective, the situation looked completely different. To her, Alan was clearly a terrifying mastermind. First, he secretly destroyed the political factions, destabilizing the kingdom. Then he casually mentioned reorganizing the underworld. And now the entire criminal network belonged to them. The scariest part? He acted surprised every single time. Altea thought respectfully, as expected of Lord Alan. Even his humility is flawless. Meanwhile, Alan was busy dying internally. Soon afterward, Altea calmly asked another question. "Should our next objective be the king?" Alan nearly ascended to the heavens. Alan shouted, "Absolutely not!" Altea blinked once. Alan immediately coughed and fixed his posture. Alan corrected himself awkwardly. "I mean, for now, maintaining political balance is important. Altia's eyes slightly widened. Altia thought, incredible. She silently admired him even more. Altia thought respectfully, he already possesses enough power to overthrow the throne, yet chooses restraint for the stability of the kingdom, a true ruler among rulers. Meanwhile, Alan was internally having a breakdown. Alan thought, why does everyone think I'm plotting treason? After ending the communication, Alan sat there blankly. At some point, without wanting it, without planning it, without understanding how, he had somehow become the hidden ruler of the underworld, all because people kept misunderstanding his casual comments. Alan covered his face tiredly. Alan muttered, I just wanted a peaceful, noble life. Then his eyes drifted toward another object on the table, a letter, a very suspicious-looking royal letter. Alan immediately felt fear. Slowly opening it, he started reading. The royal palace would host a New Year's banquet 1 month later for the first time in 5 years, and by direct order of Her Majesty, Count Palatiano's attendance was mandatory. Silence filled the room. Alan could only internally scream in frustration, because all he truly wanted was to peacefully live his quiet, noble life on the 5th floor of the Labyrinth City, the place of blue grasslands and ruins. In that place, where even after half a year the traces of the battle from that day still had not disappeared, it appeared. Flap. It stepped forward. The figure wore a hood, a black stellar robe, and ominous black ornaments hanging from its waist and hands. It began to walk across the 5th floor. It walked across the place where the mercenaries had fought the outer god half a year ago. It walked across the place where Alan had once stood, and at last it stopped at the exact spot where he had finished off the outer god. The figure murmured. It tilted its head repeatedly, as though the place was both fascinating and completely incomprehensible. How much time passed like that? Until just moments before, it had simply stood there without movement, staring down at the ground. Then the figure let out a soft laugh. It smiled broadly, as if something about this situation amused it deeply. The figure said, I did not think he would be able to do this much. It muttered the words in a voice that could not be identified as either male or female. After a brief pause, the figure said, interesting. Truly, I wonder how far he can go. This is becoming fun. A smile spread across its face, innocent like a child who had just discovered a new toy. The figure said, if he can endure the next one as well, then this will become truly entertaining. Returning to Alan, who received the letter, he thought, I was wondering why the queen invited me, but maybe it's related to Kalfa. In fact, Cretinia Sion, the 8th monarch of Asteria. She was the 8th monarch of Asteria, and despite the fact that the nobles were running wild, she neither visibly managed the state nor participated in political games, yet still held considerable authority. The reason was the power possessed by Cretinia Sion, or more precisely, the power held exclusively by the royal bloodline of Asteria, the Golden Chronicle Eye. Though it was called the Golden Chronicle Eye, it was not actually an ability related to vision. As far as Alan knew, the name came simply from the clear golden eyes that members of the royal family were born with. The inherited ability itself was simple in explanation. The power to pass authority down through generations. Like carrying over saved data in a game, power itself could be directly transferred to the next generation. The concept sounded simple, but its implications were anything but. With each generation, the accumulated authority grew stronger, enough that the royal family could maintain its rule without ever needing to involve itself deeply in political struggles. And as a result, the nobles instinctively knew better than to cross the line. As far as the setting went, Cretinia Sion simply did not move because she found it bothersome. Alan briefly recalled the indifferent, almost emotionless expression he had seen in her game illustration. Alan thought, at this level, I might face some political pressure, but given her personality, she might just ignore it entirely. He remembered how she acted whenever she appeared in the game. Essentially, unless one of the 5 calamities descended upon Asteria, she was a complete non-interventionist. When a calamity appeared, she would briefly join the player's party and display absurd, overwhelming martial power. power. Alan asked himself in fear, is she really going to take action just because of what's happening in the underworld? But otherwise, the queen showed no interest in the affairs of her kingdom. She was so detached that among psychedelia players, there was even a running joke that she was less a monarch and more a sleeping dragon of the kingdom. Alan allowed himself to relax and thought, maybe this isn't so bad. If I can take this opportunity to weaken Kalfa, Alan added, and create a sort of tug-of-war with the queen so she doesn't feel attacked, it'll also give me a good excuse to take a more passive role within the faction. Alan placed a hand on his forehead and sighed inwardly. Since the queen is a big fan of laissez-faire, it should go smoothly. It's not like I'm challenging the royal authority. On the forest road connecting the kingdom of Asteria to the desert city of Colony, a man stood alone. In front of him lay a corpse, a brutal corpse, its right hand still gripping a quill, killed before it could even comprehend what had struck it. Its neck twisted twice around, and although more than a month had passed since its death, there was no sign of decay, as though preservation magic had been applied. The man stared at it for a moment. Then the proxy let out a dry laugh and crouched down, reaching out to touch the body. The proxy muttered coldly, "He's already dead." His neck was snapped twice. Then, as he stood there, the proxy's mind drifted back. He suddenly recalled what had happened when he once met the man who had issued the order to eliminate Alan. The contractor had slammed his hand on the table and shouted in rage, his voice echoing through the room. "I have absolutely zero news about my request to eliminate Palatio," he continued furiously, his face twisted in anger. "Is the agency incompetent or what? Is this how you treat your clients? Go get your superior, right away!" The assassin standing before him bowed politely and replied in a calm voice, "I will look into it immediately." But inwardly he cursed the man. The assassin thought bitterly, "This is going to fall back on me." Returning to the forest road, the proxy lifted his foot and kicked the corpse lightly. At the moment of impact, residual mana scattered into the air like dust. The proxy's eyes narrowed. He immediately recognized it. Anti-decay magic. He licked his lips unconsciously. There was only one reason to preserve a corpse like this. A warning. A message that said, if you don't want to end up like this, don't come closer. The proxy thought slowly. So this is what happened when someone tried to deal with Count Palatio. He stood silent for a moment, recalling the request the dead man had taken 2 months earlier. Then his thoughts sharpened. When, how, and in what way should I take revenge? The proxies were not bound by loyalty to one another. The only thing that mattered was their reputation. Their near-perfect success rate, the core of their identity, had to remain intact. The proxy thought coldly, the boss is going to lose it if he hears our success rate is no longer 100%. However, he was not planning to act immediately. The proxy narrowed his eyes. He thought, he's definitely strong. So the rumors weren't exaggerated after all. He recalled everything he had heard about Count Palladio. At first, he had dismissed it as typical noble exaggeration, empty achievements inflated for prestige. But now, seeing one of their own die without even managing to resist, that assumption no longer held. The proxy thought carefully. Since I can't gather enough force right now, I should find someone who truly understands Count Palatio. A faint smile appeared on his face as he turned his gaze toward Caliburn Castle. Deus Macalian, one of the master knights tied to Count Palatio. Inside Caliburn Castle, Deus was walking calmly through the corridor. Then he suddenly stopped. Without turning around, he spoke in a low voice. Behind me, a man slowly revealed himself. The proxy stepped forward, holding his scythe, and smirked. I masked my presence perfectly. You're quite perceptive. He tilted his head slightly and added with a grin, our target isn't you, it's Count Palatio. He raised his hand casually. Tell me everything you know about him, and I will leave here as if nothing happened. We will not come after you again. His smile darkened. But if you refuse, he never finished. A sudden silence fell. Then he saw it. Blood. And in the next instant, the entire scene had changed. The proxy's eyes widened slightly. Violet threads, countless clear purple lines, glowing beneath the blue moonlight, filled his vision. Like a spider web, they stretched across the entire estate. No, not just the estate. His entire field of view was covered. The threads wrapped around everything. His allies, Salgui's body, Juriyong's body, even around him. Deus, and he spoke slowly, his voice tight. So, you're also part of the agency. The threads tightened. They coiled around his body and his scythe. He tried to move, but couldn't. His breath trembled. What is this? Before he could understand, his own scythe shifted. It moved on its own, and in a single motion, it cut through his neck. The last thing the man saw as his consciousness faded was the blade turning inward as he stabbed his own throat, and beyond it, a pair of chilling violet eyes watching him without emotion. A voice echoed coldly, "How dare you speak like that in front of me?" The scene transitioned once again. This time, the four sins were shown sitting together while communicating through a crystal ball. During the discussion, Seolrang repeatedly insisted that she would one day marry Alan. However, Utia strongly disagreed with her claims. As usual, the two quickly fell into another argument. Listening to their constant bickering slowly began to irritate Radan. The discussion between the four sins continued, as Utia firmly reminded everyone that they were merely shadows serving the great moon Alan. Seolrang immediately complained to Reen about Utia's harsh attitude. However, Reen calmly explained that Utia did not mean any harm and was simply being herself. Reen then pointed out that Utia had served the great moon far longer than the rest of them. Hearing this only made Utia even more confident in her stance, while Seolrang looked completely unconvinced. Meanwhile, Radan silently watched the argument unfold and became confused after noticing that even Reen had somehow become involved in the debate. Soon afterward, Reen revealed that she wanted to personally send her own reports. Utia quickly reminded her that she had always handled all correspondence for the group. However, Reen explained that she specifically wanted to report information regarding the tracker eye herself. Utia immediately insisted that there had never been any problems with her reports until now. However, Reen still wanted to personally deliver the information related to the tracker eye. Along with that, she also wished to include some personal updates of her own. While saying this, Reen suddenly blushed and began laughing softly to herself. The unexpected reaction instantly shocked everyone present. For a brief moment, the others misunderstood the situation and wondered whether there was some special reason behind her behavior. Realizing that everyone was staring at her strangely, Reen quickly cleared her throat and apologized, claiming that she had simply remembered something amusing. Although she explained herself, several suspicious looks still remained. At that moment, Deus finally joined the meeting and apologized for arriving late. The others assured him that he was still on time, though they became curious about the reason behind his delayed arrival. Before the meeting could properly begin, Deus revealed that he had something important to announce first. He explained that an organization known as the Agency had begun targeting the Great Moon. The revelation instantly shocked everyone. Deus then clarified that the organization originally consisted of 15 members, although only 12 remained after he had personally eliminated 3 of them. He also mentioned that he had already located several of the remaining members. The moment Seolrang heard this, her expression darkened with murderous intent as she immediately demanded that every single one of them be killed. Reen also revealed a terrifying expression and began talking about tearing them apart completely. Unlike the others, Radan tried to remain calm and insisted that they should first gather information. He believed they needed to share intelligence and establish a proper plan, just as they normally did during missions. However, his cautious approach immediately caused the other sins to glare at him suspiciously. Some of them even began questioning whether he had become a traitor. They worried about what might happen if the enemies managed to harm the Great Moon. Radan became frustrated after hearing those accusations and tried explaining that his point was simply about understanding the full situation before acting recklessly. Unfortunately, the others seemed far more interested in eliminating the threat immediately than listening to his explanation. As everyone continued staring at him in silence, Radan eventually gave up and admitted defeat. In the end, he agreed that immediate action was necessary. The moment he did, the suspicious atmosphere instantly disappeared, leaving him feeling even more defeated than before. Finally, Utia decided that the meeting would resume only after the matter with the agency had been settled. With that conclusion reached, the 4 sins ended their discussion and immediately began preparing to take action. After the meeting ended, Radan remained deep in thought. He felt frustrated after being treated like a traitor simply for suggesting caution. Even so, he reminded himself that the Great Moon had given him power and the chance to achieve revenge. Because of that, his loyalty would never waver. However, he also realized that the devotion shown by the other sins had already crossed the line into complete fanaticism. As the tension faded, the scene shifted to Teria, the capital of Asteria, inside the royal palace. Alan arrived at the grand banquet hall while several counts followed closely behind him, staring at him with obvious interest. Evan quietly reflected on Alan's current status. Since Alan had become the leader of Kalfa and gained immense popularity, the peaceful days of quietly spending evenings alone had completely disappeared. Even so, Evan was still uncertain whether this new situation was truly better. Meanwhile, Alan himself was becoming increasingly nervous. As people continued watching him, he suddenly panicked and felt as though everyone believed he had come to challenge the queen directly. In reality, most of the nobles were simply curious about him, but Alan immediately misunderstood their attention and imagined the worst possible scenario. Trying to calm himself down, Alan quickly reconsidered his plan. He decided that showing complete submission to the queen would likely make everything proceed more smoothly. After entering deeper into the banquet hall, Alan carefully observed the surroundings. The palace's overwhelming grandeur immediately impressed him. At the same time, he noticed how openly the royalist and aristocrat factions were carrying out their political schemes. He soon realized that most of them were ignoring Kalfa because they believed the queen was about to completely crush the faction. Even with that pressure, Alan desperately tried to compose himself. He convinced himself that after being scolded by the queen, he would simply pretend to give in and peacefully accept everything. Eventually, Alan and the other counts approached the queen together and bowed respectfully before her. Standing before them was Sancretania, the 8th monarch of Asteria. After allowing everyone to rise,